No one in that quiet Tulsa classroom was prepared for the moment a simple observation turned into a chilling suspicion that refused to go away. It started with something so small it could have been ignored, something most people would have brushed off as nothing. But Nolan Pierce wasn't most people. He had spent years watching children closely, reading what they didn't say as much as what they did. And that morning, as sunlight stretched across the classroom floor and the usual hum of young voices filled the air, his attention locked onto one child who no longer fit the rhythm of the room. Maisie Holloway had always been easy to notice, but for the right reasons. She used to sit near the front, her small hands always busy with crayons, sketching horses with a level of care that made them feel alive. Her eyes would light up whenever the conversation drifted toward animals, her quiet excitement breaking through her usual shyness. There was a softness about her, the kind that made teachers instinctively protective. But that version of Maisie had started to disappear. It wasn't sudden. That was what made it worse. The change crept in slowly, almost invisibly at first. She stopped raising her hand. She stopped finishing her drawings. Then she stopped talking altogether. While the rest of the class laughed and traded stories during breaks, she began isolating herself, shrinking into corners as if trying to take up less space. Nolan noticed all of it. And then he noticed something else. Her posture had changed. She sat hunched forward, arms often wrapped around her midsection as if guarding it. At first, he thought it was discomfort, maybe something minor. Kids got stomachaches all the time. But this wasn't that. Day after day, the shape of her body seemed different. Her stomach looked swollen. Not in the way a child might after eating too much. Not soft or uneven. It looked tight, stretched, unnatural. And the more Nolan saw it, the more impossible it became to ignore. He tried to convince himself he was overthinking it. Maybe it was just a growth phase. Maybe he was imagining things. But every instinct he had built over years in the classroom told him something wasn't right. Then came the drawing. It was supposed to be a simple assignment. Draw your family. Nothing complicated. Just a safe, ordinary activity that usually filled the room with bright colors and happy chatter. Most children sketched smiling stick figures, houses, pets, little suns in the corners of the page. Maisie didn't. When Nolan picked up her paper, the air seemed to shift. There were 3 figures. A woman, drawn simply. A small girl with braids, clearly Maisie. And then there was the 3rd figure. Tall. Dark. Completely filled in with black. No eyes. No face. Just a shape looming beside the others. It wasn't just a drawing. It felt like a message. Something cold settled in Nolan's chest. Before he could even process it, he heard a whisper, barely audible, coming from Maisie's desk as she leaned toward another child. A single sentence. Quiet. Flat. Heavy. And it hit Nolan like a shockwave. He didn't react immediately. He couldn't. His mind froze, caught between disbelief and something far worse. Because children didn't say things like that unless something had already gone very, very wrong. From that moment on, everything changed. The rest of the day blurred together. The sounds of the classroom faded into the background, replaced by a growing tension that Nolan couldn't shake. Every glance at Maisie reinforced it. The way she avoided eye contact. The way her shoulders tightened whenever someone moved too close. The way she seemed to exist in a constant state of quiet fear. By the time the final bell rang, Nolan had already made up his mind. He couldn't ignore it. Not this time. As the other students rushed out, filling the hallway with laughter and noise, Maisie stayed behind, standing near her desk with her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. She didn't ask why she had been told to wait. She didn't question anything. She just stood there. Silent. Still. Waiting. And in that silence, Nolan felt the full weight of what he was about to do. Because there was no easy way to ask the question forming in his mind. No gentle version. No safe wording. Only the truth he was afraid to hear. He knelt down slightly so he wouldn't tower over her, trying to make himself less intimidating, more approachable. He searched for the right words, but they didn't exist. They never did in situations like this. Maisie barely looked up. Her eyes were already filled with something no child should carry. And in that moment, Nolan realized something that sent a chill down his spine. Whatever was happening to her, it had already gone too far. The moment the truth refused to come out, the fear became something far more dangerous, because silence can hide things no one is ready to face. Nolan Pierce didn't get the answer he was hoping for. He got something worse. Maisie didn't speak. She didn't deny anything. She didn't try to explain. She simply broke down, her small body trembling as tears slipped quietly down her face, as if even crying had to be done carefully, without drawing too much attention. And in that fragile moment, Nolan understood something with terrifying clarity. Whatever she was carrying inside her wasn't just physical. It was fear. And fear like that doesn't grow on its own. From that second forward, Nolan knew he had crossed an invisible line. There was no going back to being just a teacher who stayed within safe boundaries. What he had seen, what he had heard, and what he had felt in that silence demanded action, even if he didn't yet know what that action should look like. The school day ended like any other on the surface. Parents arrived. Cars lined up. Children ran into waiting arms. But to Nolan, everything felt distorted, like watching a normal world through cracked glass. Maisie stood beside him near the front gate, her small backpack hanging loosely from her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the ground. She didn't look toward the parking lot. She didn't search for anyone. She simply waited, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. And then her mother arrived. Dana Holloway moved quickly, like someone constantly racing against time. Her appearance was neat but strained, her expression carrying a tightness that didn't quite match the polite smile she forced when she saw her daughter. There was something rigid in her movements, something rehearsed, as though she had practiced appearing calm. Nolan watched closely. Every detail mattered now. When he approached her, choosing his words with care, he expected confusion, maybe concern. Instead, what he saw unfold was something else entirely. Deflection. At first, it came wrapped in casual dismissal. Children change, she implied. Moods shift. Behavior comes and goes. Nothing unusual. Nothing serious. Just phases. But Nolan didn't back down. He pointed out the changes, the silence, the isolation, the physical signs that couldn't be ignored. And then, carefully, he mentioned what Maisie had implied. Not directly. Not accusingly. But enough to signal that something deeper might be wrong. That was when the atmosphere changed. The mother's expression hardened almost instantly. The softness disappeared, replaced by something sharper, defensive, controlled, almost rehearsed. The idea that anything could be wrong inside their home was rejected before it could fully exist. It wasn't just denial. It was resistance. And the more Nolan tried to keep the conversation grounded in concern, the more firmly she pushed back. Her responses became quicker, shorter, less open. The possibility of a medical issue was brushed aside as something minor. The emotional withdrawal was reduced to stress. Everything had an explanation, and none of them required further investigation. To anyone else, it might have sounded reasonable. To Nolan, it sounded like someone trying too hard to close a door that had already been opened. When the conversation ended, it didn't end with reassurance. It ended with distance. The kind of distance that leaves a question hanging in the air, unanswered and heavier than before. Maisie was led away without a word. She didn't look back. That was what stayed with Nolan the most. Not the mother's reaction. Not even the silence during their conversation. It was the way Maisie walked beside her. Quiet, compliant, as if she had already learned that speaking would only make things worse. That night, Nolan didn't sleep. He tried. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment over and over again. The drawing. The whisper. The tears. The way her body seemed to shrink into itself. The way her mother shut everything down before it could be examined. Each memory fit together like pieces of a puzzle that formed a picture he didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And if he stayed silent, he would become part of it. By morning, the decision was no longer optional. It was necessary. His hands felt heavier than usual as he reached for his phone. This wasn't something teachers were trained to handle alone. This was beyond classroom management, beyond guidance, beyond anything that could be solved with patience and care inside school walls. This required intervention. The first call was cautious, official, controlled. The kind of response that follows procedures, not instincts. Without concrete proof, without a clear statement from the child, everything remained uncertain. It would be noted, observed, possibly followed up. But it wasn't enough. Nolan could feel it. So he made another call. This time, the reaction was different. The person on the other end listened without interruption, absorbing every detail. The behavioral changes, the physical symptoms, the emotional response, the subtle implication that pointed toward something darker. And when Nolan finished, there was a pause that felt heavier than any words. Then came the shift. This wouldn't be ignored. This wouldn't be delayed. A formal process would begin. For the first time since the previous afternoon, Nolan felt a slight release in his chest. Not relief, but movement. Something had started. Something bigger than him was now involved. But even as that realization settled in, a new tension took its place. Because once something like this begins, it doesn't stay hidden for long. And somewhere behind the walls of that quiet house, the truth was still sitting in silence, waiting to either be uncovered or buried even deeper. By the time the investigation officially began, the danger was no longer just what might be happening. It was how convincingly everything could be made to look normal. The visit came quietly. No sirens. No uniforms meant to alarm the neighborhood. Just a simple vehicle pulling up in front of a modest house on a quiet street in Tulsa, where nothing on the outside suggested anything was wrong. The lawn was trimmed. The curtains were drawn neatly. The kind of place people passed every day without a second glance. But inside, something didn't match. Investigator Harper Reed had seen it before. The kind of calm that felt constructed, not natural. The kind of order that existed to be seen, not lived in. And the moment she stepped into the Holloway home, that feeling settled in her chest like a warning she couldn't ignore. Everything was too clean, too arranged, too careful. Dana Holloway greeted her with a controlled politeness that bordered on rehearsed. Every movement measured. Every expression calculated. Behind her, Troy stood with the quiet presence of someone who didn't intend to say much, but whose silence carried weight. Harper didn't rush. She observed. The way Dana answered questions without hesitation, already prepared with explanations that fit together just a little too perfectly. The way Troy watched every exchange closely, his posture tight, his attention fixed not on the concern, but on the control of the situation. And most of all, the way the subject of their daughter was handled, not with curiosity or urgency, but with irritation. As if the real problem wasn't Maisie's condition, but the fact that someone had noticed it. The medical explanation was presented quickly. A minor issue. Digestive. Temporary. Already addressed. A short clinic visit. A simple report. No need for concern. On paper, it sounded harmless. In reality, it raised more questions than answers. The documentation was thin. No tests. No specialist involvement. No urgency. Just vague language that avoided commitment. Harper had seen reports like that before. Documents that didn't confirm anything, but were used to dismiss everything. And then there was Maisie. She wasn't brought forward immediately. That, in itself, said something. When she finally appeared, it was like watching a shadow step into the room. She moved carefully, quietly, as if even her presence needed permission. Her eyes didn't lift. Her hands stayed close to her body. Every instinct she showed was defensive, withdrawn. Children who feel safe don't move like that. Children who are okay don't disappear while standing in front of you. Harper didn't press her, not yet. This wasn't a moment for force. It was a moment for reading what wasn't being said. And what she saw didn't match the parents' version of reality. Not even close. By the time she left the house, the conclusion had already begun to form, not as a certainty, but as a pattern she recognized all too well. A controlled environment. Defensive guardians. A child showing clear emotional distress. A physical condition being minimized instead of investigated. It wasn't proof. But it was enough to keep going. Back at school, the atmosphere had started to shift. Children notice things adults pretend not to see. Whispers began to spread, not cruel at first, just curious. Why Maisie didn't play anymore. Why she stayed alone. Why her body looked different. The playground, once a place of noise and movement, became another space where she sat still, separated from everything around her. Isolation doesn't need to be forced. Sometimes it grows naturally when no one steps in. Nolan watched it happen from a distance, the weight of it pressing down on him every day. He tried to maintain normalcy, to keep the classroom steady, but his focus always drifted back to her, to the way she seemed to be fading right in front of him. And then something unexpected happened. A new student arrived. Willa Boone didn't enter the classroom quietly. There was a natural ease about her, the kind of confidence that doesn't demand attention but earns it anyway. She adapted quickly, finding her place without hesitation, speaking without fear. And for reasons no one could explain. She chose Maisie. Not the loudest child. Not the most welcoming group. She went straight to the quietest corner of the room and sat beside the girl everyone else had started to avoid. At first, there was nothing. Maisie didn't respond. Didn't engage. Didn't react. But Willa didn't leave. Day after day, she stayed. Sitting beside her. Sharing small things. Existing without pressure. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. Maisie started to speak again. Not to the class. Not to the teacher. Only to her. It was quiet. Careful. Fragile. But it was something. And sometimes, something is all it takes. Nolan didn't interrupt. He didn't draw attention to it. He simply watched, knowing that whatever came out of those conversations might be the first real truth anyone had heard since this began. Then, one afternoon during an ordinary art session, it happened. A detail slipped out. Small. Innocent. Almost forgettable if you weren't listening closely. But Nolan was listening. Maisie mentioned a trip. Not recently. Weeks ago. A place outside the city. Quiet. Isolated. A body of water that wasn't moving. Warm. Still. Unclean in a way children don't recognize, but remember. She had gone in. Played in it. Stayed in it. And afterward. Everything changed. The fever came first. Then the pain. Then the swelling. Nolan didn't react outwardly. But inside, something clicked. Not a suspicion. Not a fear. A connection. For the first time since this began, the pieces weren't pointing towards something hidden inside the house. They were pointing somewhere else entirely. And that realization didn't bring relief. It brought urgency. Because if the truth wasn't what everyone feared, then it might be something just as dangerous, something already growing inside her, unnoticed, untreated, and getting worse with every passing day. And now, for the first time, there was a direction. But also a terrifying question. Had they been looking in the wrong place all along while time was quietly running out? The moment the truth began to surface, it didn't bring relief. It exposed how close everyone had come to losing her while chasing the wrong fear. That night, Nolan Pierce stopped thinking like a teacher and started thinking like someone racing against time. The detail Maisie had revealed refused to leave his mind. A quiet trip. A stagnant pond. Warm water that didn't move. A fever that came after. Then the swelling. Then the silence. It wasn't random anymore. It wasn't a mystery wrapped in emotion. It was a sequence. And sequences have causes. Sitting alone in his dim kitchen, the glow of his laptop reflecting off tired eyes, Nolan began searching with a focus that bordered on obsession. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was matching patterns. Symptom by symptom. Timeline by timeline. Every article, every medical case, every obscure report he could find. At first, the results were scattered. Minor infections, harmless conditions, temporary illnesses that didn't explain the severity he had witnessed. None of them matched the slow, progressive change he had seen in Maisie's body. None of them explained the way her abdomen had tightened, stretched, and refused to return to normal. But he kept going. Because something inside him was certain. This wasn't small. And then he found it. Buried among medical journals and case studies, a single condition began to repeat itself across different sources. Rare in some places. Overlooked in others. But always described with the same unsettling progression. Exposure to contaminated freshwater. Parasites entering through the skin. Initial fever. Gradual internal damage. And then, abdominal swelling so severe it became the most visible sign. Nolan's breathing slowed as he read, then quickened as realization took hold. The descriptions were too precise. Too aligned. The images that accompanied the articles made it worse. Children, thin and withdrawn, with distended stomachs that looked hauntingly familiar. He didn't need to guess anymore. He knew. Maisie wasn't hiding a secret. She was carrying an illness. A dangerous one. And it had been growing inside her for weeks while everyone argued, denied, and misinterpreted what they were seeing. The weight of that realization hit hard. Not just because of what it meant, but because of how close they had come to missing it entirely. Every delay mattered now. Every day without treatment made it worse. And suddenly, the situation shifted from suspicion to urgency. The next morning didn't feel like a normal day. It felt like the edge of something about to break. Harper Reed returned to the Holloway home, but this time, the atmosphere was different before she even stepped inside. There was tension in the air, thicker, sharper, harder to ignore. The kind of tension that builds when pressure has been applied for too long without release. The calm facade from before had cracks now. Subtle, but visible. Dana's composure wasn't as steady. Troy's silence carried less control and more agitation. And the house itself, despite still being orderly, no longer felt convincing. It felt like something being held together out of necessity rather than confidence. Harper didn't waste time. The previous explanations no longer held weight. The vague medical report, the dismissals, the insistence that everything was under control, they didn't match the evidence anymore. Not the physical signs. Not the behavioral changes. Not the timeline that was now starting to make sense. And most importantly, not the risk. This wasn't about possibility anymore. This was about protection. When Harper made it clear that a full medical evaluation was no longer optional, the reaction was immediate. Not explosive, but defensive in a way that revealed more than it concealed. The idea of outside intervention, of losing control over the situation, triggered something deeper than simple disagreement. Fear. Not fear for the child. Fear of consequences. But the situation had already moved beyond their control. Because when adults hesitate, systems step in. And this time, the system wasn't backing down. By the end of that visit, the line had been drawn clearly. Either the parents allowed proper medical testing under supervision, or the state would take temporary custody to ensure the child received it. There was no middle ground left. No more delays. No more explanations. Just a decision. That night, the Holloway house wasn't quiet in the same way it had been before. The silence wasn't controlled anymore. It was heavy. Fractured. Filled with the unspoken realization that everything was about to change. And for the first time since this began, Troy Holloway allowed himself to think back. Not to the accusations. Not to the confrontation. But to that day. The trip. The pond. He remembered it clearly now, the stillness of the water, the way it didn't flow, the surface broken only by scattered leaves. He remembered how Maisie had laughed, stepping into it without hesitation, how he had watched from a distance, uneasy but unwilling to ruin the moment. It had seemed harmless. It had felt normal. But now, that memory looked different. Now, it looked like the beginning. And as that realization settled in, something inside him shifted, not into guilt of intent, but into something just as heavy. The understanding that sometimes the worst harm doesn't come from what you do. It comes from what you fail to see. Back at his apartment, Nolan didn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't uncertainty keeping him awake. It was clarity. He had connected the pieces. He had found the cause. And now, everything depended on whether the truth would be accepted in time. Because if he was right, then Maisie wasn't just in danger. She was already suffering from something that could get worse with every passing hour. And now, the question was no longer what was happening to her. It was whether anyone would act fast enough to stop it. When the truth finally reached the courtroom, it didn't arrive as certainty. It arrived as a race against time where one decision could either save a child or break everything beyond repair. The hearing moved faster than anyone expected. There was no room for delay anymore. Too many signs had been ignored, too many warnings softened by doubt. Now everything stood exposed under a different kind of light, the kind that doesn't allow assumptions to hide behind comfort. Inside the courtroom, the tension was immediate. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sat in the air, heavy and unmoving, pressing down on every person in that room. On one side, the system, structured, methodical, driven by responsibility. On the other, a family, defensive, exhausted, and slowly unraveling under the weight of what they didn't want to admit. At the center of it all was a single, undeniable fact. A child was suffering, and no one could explain why. The arguments unfolded in layers. At first, it was about responsibility. The parents insisted that they had acted within reason, that they had sought help, that they had followed what they believed to be a harmless medical opinion. To them, it was never neglect. It was caution, misunderstanding, maybe even fear. But those explanations began to weaken under scrutiny. Because what stood out wasn't what they had done. It was what they hadn't. No proper testing. No specialist consultation. No urgency despite visible physical changes that had persisted for weeks. The more the timeline was examined, the clearer it became that something critical had been overlooked, not out of malice, but out of refusal to confront uncertainty. And in cases like this, refusal can be just as dangerous. Then came the turning point. Nolan Pierce stepped forward, not as an expert, not as authority, but as the one person who had been paying attention when everything began. His presence shifted the tone of the room. He wasn't there to accuse. He wasn't there to prove guilt. He was there to connect what no one else had connected. Step by step, he laid out the pattern, not emotionally, not dramatically, but with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. The behavioral change. The physical progression. The moment when Maisie spoke about the trip. The stagnant water. The fever that followed. And finally, the possibility no one had considered soon enough. A parasitic infection. Not a theory built on fear, but on evidence drawn from patterns that matched too closely to be coincidence. The kind of condition that doesn't disappear on its own. The kind that worsens quietly while people search for easier explanations. The courtroom shifted. It wasn't disbelief anymore. It was realization. The judge didn't react immediately. He listened. He observed. He weighed the arguments not just by what was said, but by what had been missed. And as the silence stretched, the direction of the decision became clear. Not because of emotion, but because of necessity. This was no longer about determining fault. It was about preventing harm. The ruling came with precision. Immediate, comprehensive medical testing would be carried out under official supervision. No delays. No alternatives. No room for interpretation. The child's health would be evaluated fully, and the results would determine everything that followed. It was the only decision left. Because uncertainty had already lasted too long. What followed happened quickly, faster than the family could process, faster than fear could catch up with reality. From the courtroom to the hospital, the transition was immediate. The urgency stripped away hesitation, forcing action where doubt had once lived. The hospital didn't feel like a place of answers at first. It felt like a place of waiting. Bright lights. Cold hallways. The quiet movement of professionals who understood that something serious was unfolding, even if they hadn't yet confirmed what it was. Every test, every procedure added another layer of tension, another stretch of time where nothing was known for certain. Maisie endured it all without resistance. Too tired to question. Too worn down to react. Her small body had already been carrying more than anyone realized. Hours passed. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. But inside that building, everything hung on a single outcome. Every minute stretched longer than the last, until waiting itself became unbearable. And then, the answer came. Not slowly, not gently. Direct. Clear. Unavoidable. The diagnosis confirmed what Nolan had feared, and what no one else had dared to fully consider. A severe parasitic infection. Advanced. Progressive. Dangerous, but treatable. The room didn't erupt. There were no dramatic reactions. Just a silence that settled in deeper than before, because now the truth had weight. Now it had consequences. Everything made sense. The swelling. The pain. The fever. The emotional withdrawal. Even the words Maisie had whispered, the ones that had been misunderstood from the very beginning. It had never been what they feared. But it had always been something real. And something serious. For the first time since this began, the focus shifted completely. No more suspicion. No more assumptions. Only action. Treatment began immediately. Because now, there was no time left to waste. And as the reality of it all settled in, one thought lingered in the background, quiet, but impossible to ignore. If they had waited any longer, they might have found the truth too late. The moment everything was finally understood, the real weight of the story didn't come from what almost happened. It came from how close they were to losing her because no one listened soon enough. The hospital room was quiet in a way that felt different from before. Not the heavy silence of fear and uncertainty, but the fragile stillness that follows truth.
Machines hummed softly.
Dim lights reflected against pale walls. And in the center of it all, Maisie Holloway lay still, her small body finally receiving the treatment it had needed for far too long. The crisis hadn't ended. But it had been named. And sometimes, naming something is the first step toward saving it. The infection inside her wasn't invisible anymore. It wasn't misunderstood. It wasn't something dismissed as stress, or imagination, or something darker that never existed. It had a cause. It had a timeline. And most importantly, it had a treatment. Doctors moved quickly, guided by certainty now instead of guesswork. Medication began working through her system, slowly, methodically, fighting what had been growing unchecked for weeks. The swelling wouldn't disappear overnight. The damage wouldn't reverse instantly. But for the first time, her body wasn't fighting alone. Across the room, her parents sat with a stillness that spoke louder than any argument they had made before. Dana no longer tried to explain. Troy no longer tried to defend. Because the truth had taken away the need for both. What replaced it was something far heavier, realization. Not the kind that comes all at once, but the kind that builds with every memory that now looks different. Every moment they had dismissed. Every sign they had minimized. Every explanation they had accepted because it was easier than asking harder questions. They hadn't meant to harm her. But they had failed to see her. And that failure nearly cost everything. Troy's thoughts circled back to that day again and again. The quiet trip outside the city, the still pond, the laughter that now echoed differently in his mind. What had once felt like a simple, harmless memory had transformed into the starting point of something he hadn't understood. He hadn't caused it on purpose. But he had been there. And sometimes, being there and not knowing is enough to carry its own kind of guilt. Dana, sitting beside the bed, felt something even more difficult to face. Not just the fear of what could have happened, but the realization of how fiercely she had protected the wrong thing. She had defended normalcy, defended appearances, defended the idea that everything was fine. And in doing so, she had delayed the truth. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was honest. For the first time, they weren't trying to control what was happening. They were simply facing it. Maisie, drifting in and out of sleep, no longer carried the same tension in her body. The fear hadn't disappeared completely, but it had changed. It wasn't the quiet, trapped fear of not being understood anymore. It was something softer. Something that came with the feeling that, finally, someone knew what was wrong. Days passed. Then weeks. Recovery didn't happen all at once. It came slowly, in small changes that only became noticeable when you looked back. The swelling began to reduce. Her energy returned in pieces. Her eyes, once distant and guarded, started to regain something that had been missing for a long time. Light. By the time she returned to school, the difference was undeniable. The classroom that had once felt like a place she was disappearing inside of now became something else entirely. She walked in differently. Not boldly, not loudly, but steadily. Like someone who had come through something difficult and didn't fully understand it yet, but knew she wasn't alone anymore. Nolan noticed immediately. Not just the physical change, but the emotional one. She didn't avoid eye contact the way she used to. She didn't fold into herself when others moved too close. She wasn't completely free of what had happened, but she was no longer trapped inside it. And that was enough. Willa remained by her side, just as she had from the beginning, as if nothing had changed, because for her it hadn't. She had simply stayed when no one else did. And in doing so, she had become part of the reason Maisie found her way back. At home, things were different too. Not perfect. Not instantly healed. But real. The conversations that had once been avoided were now unavoidable, and necessary. The distance that had quietly grown between parent and child was slowly replaced with something more intentional. More aware. More careful. They listened now. Not because they were told to, but because they understood what happens when you don't. Time moved forward the way it always does, carrying everything with it. The fear faded. The urgency softened. The crisis became memory. But the impact of it remained, shaping everything that came after. And in the end, what stayed wasn't just the relief that Maisie had recovered. It was the truth behind it all. That a child had been trying to communicate something real. Not through clear words, not through direct answers, but through behavior, through silence, through fragments of truth that didn't make sense until someone chose to listen carefully enough. Nolan never saw himself as a hero. He hadn't solved everything. He hadn't known the answer from the start. But he had done something that mattered more than certainty. He had paid attention. And sometimes, that is the difference between a story that ends in tragedy and one that gets a second chance.